I wanted to share with you today my favorite author, one of my favorite authors. I actually have several. And this is Roald Dahl, is his name. And he's written a lot of amazing books. And this is called The Witches. And it's illustrated by Quentin Blake. The reason I wanted to read this to you this way, without a mask, is it's such a great story. And I think maybe you can listen a little better if I don't have that mask on. So enjoy. I think you're going to love this story. In fairy tales, witches always wear silly black hats and black cloaks, and they ride on broomsticks. But this is not a fairy tale. This is about real witches. The most important thing you should know about real witches is this. Listen very carefully. Never forget what is coming next. Real witches dress in ordinary clothes and look very much like ordinary women. They live in ordinary houses and they work in ordinary jobs. That is why they're so hard to catch. A real witch hates children with a red hot sizzling hatred that is more sizzling and red hot than any hatred you could possibly imagine. A real witch spends all her time plotting to get rid of the children in her particular territory. Her passion is to do away with them one by one. It's all she thinks about the whole day long. Even if she's working as a cashier in a supermarket or typing letters for a businessman or driving around in a fancy car, and she could be doing any of those things. Her mind will always be plotting and scheming and churning and burning and whizzing and fizzing with murderous, bloodthirsty thoughts. Which child, she says to herself all day long, exactly which child shall I choose for my next squelching? A real witch gets the same pleasure from squelching a child as you get from eating a plate full of strawberries and thick cream. She reckons on doing away with one child a week. Anything less than that and she becomes grumpy. One child a week is 52 a year. Squish them and squiggle them and make them disappear. That's the motto of all witches. Very carefully, a victim is chosen. Then the witch stalks the wretched child like a hunter stalking a little bird in the forest. She treads softly. She moves quietly. She gets closer and closer, and then at last, when everything is ready, she swoops. Sparks fly, flames leap, oil boils, rats howl, and skin shrivels, and the child disappears. Now, in this picture, can you see maybe somebody that's not supposed to be there as that girl is reading a book? Do you see the witch? A witch, you must understand, does not knock children on the head or stick knives into them or shoot at them with a pistol. People who do that get caught by the police. A witch never gets caught. Don't forget that she has magic in her fingers and devilry dancing in her blood. She can make stones jump about like frogs, and she can make tongues of flames go flickering across the surface of the water. These magic powers are very frightening. Luckily, there are not a great number of real witches in the world today, but there are still quite enough to make you nervous. In England, there are probably about 100 of them altogether. Some countries have more, others have not quite so many. No country in the world is completely free from witches. A witch is always a woman. I do not wish to speak badly about women. Most women are lovely, but the fact remains that all witches are women. There's no such thing as a male witch. On the other hand, a ghoul is always a male, so indeed is a Barghest, and both are dangerous, but neither of them is half as dangerous as a real witch. As far as children are concerned, a real witch easily is the most dangerous of all the living creatures on earth. What makes her doubly dangerous is the fact that she doesn't look dangerous. Even when you know all the secrets, and you're going to hear about those in a minute, you can still never be quite sure whether it's a witch you're gazing at or just a kind lady. If a tiger were able to make himself look like a large dog with a waggy tail, you'd probably go up and pat him on the head. That'd be the end of you. It's the same with witches. They all look like nice ladies. Kindly examine this picture opposite. Which lady is the witch? That's a difficult question, but it's one that every child must try to answer. For all you know, a witch might be living next door to you right now. Or she might be the woman with the bright eyes who sat opposite you on the bus this morning. She might be that lady with the dazzling smile who offered you a sweet from a white paper bag in the street before lunch. And she might even And this will make you jump. She might even be your lovely school teacher who's reading these words to you at this very moment. Look carefully at that teacher. Perhaps she's smiling at the absurdity of all that suggestion, but don't let that put you off. It could be part of her cleverness. I'm not, of course, telling you for 1 second that your teacher is actually a witch. All I'm saying is that she might be one. It's the most unlikely, but here comes the big but. It is not impossible. Oh, if there were only a way of telling for certain whether a woman was a witch or not, then we could go round them up and put them in a meat grinder. Unhappily, there's no such way. But there are a number of little signals you can look out for, little quirky habits that all witches have in common. And if you know about these, if you remember them always, then you might just possibly manage to escape from being squelched before you're much older. I myself, and again, this is the character in the story. He's telling the story first person. So he is telling the story. And in this book, you don't ever really know his name. Later, when they make a movie, his name is Luke, but they don't ever have a name in this book. But he's telling the story, so you're going to find out everything from this guy. I myself had 2 separate encounters with witches before I was 8 years old. From the first, I escaped unharmed, but on the second occasion, I was not so lucky. And things happen to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them, and that cannot be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I am still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. My grandmother was Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches, for Norway, with its black forests and icy mountains, is where the first witches came from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I had been born there and I had lived there and I had started going to an English school. Twice a year at Christmas and in the summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. And this old lady, as far as I could gather, was just about the only surviving relative we had on either side of our family. I wanted to show you this world map just so you can kind of know where we're talking about. I mean, obviously, we live over here in the United States, right? We live in the Midwest, and so approximately where my finger is. This story takes place in 2 other countries. Okay, so we go across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean in this case, or you could go across the Pacific Ocean if this was the globe and it was round, which I do have in this classroom if you want to look at it anytime. And this part of the story also takes place way over here. It's called Norway, and also in England. So pretty far away from where we live now. But that is, Grandmama lives in Norway, and then this boy and his family live in England. I just wanted to show you that. I love to show you maps. I have a really great map in the front of the room if you ever want to take a look at that also. Okay, so that's where they lived. And sometimes in a Roald Dahl story, I just want to remind you of this. Sometimes bad things happen, and a lot of good things happen. But I can tell you that almost always, in fact, every story I can think of, children are the heroes, and I think you'll like that. So we did go visit my grandmama in Norway a lot, and twice a year we'd go to Norway to visit my grandmother, and that was their only relative. And when she and I were together, we spoke in either Norwegian or in English. It didn't matter which. We were equally fluent in both languages, and I have to admit that I felt closer to her than my own mother. Soon after my 7th birthday, my parents took me as usual to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway. And it was over there, while my father and mother and I were driving in icy weather just north of Oslo, that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling down into a rocky ravine. My parents were killed, and I was firmly strapped in the back seat, and I received only a cut on my forehead. And I won't go into the horrors of that terrible afternoon. I still get the shivers when I think about it. But I finished up, of course, back in my grandmother's house with her arms around me tight and both of us crying the whole night long. So this is Grandmama, and this is the person telling the story, the boy telling the story. And that's very tragic what happened to him with the car accident. So he's going to be living with Grandmama now. What are we going to do now? I asked her through the tears. You will stay here with me, she said, and I will look after you. Aren't I going back to England? No, she said, I could never do that. Heaven shall take my soul, but Norway shall keep my bones. And the very next day, in order that we might both try to forget our sadness, our great sadness, my grandmother started telling me stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me. But I didn't become really excited until she got on to the subject of witches. She was apparently a great expert on these creatures, and she made it very clear to me that her witch stories, unlike most of the others, were not imaginary tales. They were all true. They were the gospel truth. They were history. And everything she was telling me about witches had actually happened, and I'd better believe it. What was worse, what was far, far worse, was that witches were still with us. They were all around us, and I'd better believe that too. Are you really being truthful, Grandmama? Like really and truly truthful? My darling, she said, you will not last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one. But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandmama, so how could I spot them? You must listen to me, my grandmother said. You must remember everything I tell you. And after that, all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best. We were in the big living room at her house in Oslo, and I was ready for bed, and the curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the windows I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly on an outside world that was as black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled, and she had a massive, wide body which was smothered in gray lace. And she sat there majestic in her armchair, filling every inch of it. Not even a mouse could have squeezed in next to sit beside her. I myself, just 7 years old, was crouched on the floor of her feet, wearing pajamas, a dressing gown, and slippers. You swear you're not pulling my leg, I kept saying to her. You swear you're not just pretending. Listen, she said. I have known no less than 5 children who have simply vanished off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. The witches took them. I still think you're just trying to frighten me, I said. I am trying to make sure you don't go the same way, she said. I love you and I want you to stay with me. Well, tell me about the children who disappeared, I said. My grandmother was the only grandmother I had ever met who smoked cigars. She lit one now, a long black cigar that smelled like burning rubber. The first child I knew who disappeared, she said, was called Ragnhild Hansen. Ragnhild was about 8 at the time, and she was playing with her little sister on the lawn. And their mother, who was baking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath of air. Where's Ragnhild? She asked. She went away with a tall lady, the little sister said. What tall lady? My mother said. The tall lady in white gloves, the little sister said. She took Ragnhild by the hand and led her away. No one, my grandmother said, ever saw Ragnhild again. Didn't they search for her? I asked. They searched for miles around. Everyone in the town helped, but they never found her. Well, what happened to the other 4 children? I asked. Well, they vanished just like Ragnhild did. How, Grandmama? How did they vanish? In every case, a strange lady was seen outside the house just before it happened. But how did they vanish? I asked. The second one was very peculiar, my grandmother said. Here they are. This is how she tells him stories. So he's sitting on the ground in his pajamas, and she's smoking that awful black cigar and looking down and telling a story. Well, there was a family called Christensen, and they lived up in Hommelkollen, and they had an old oil painting in the living room, which they were very proud of. The painting showed some ducks in the yard outside of a farmhouse. And there were no people in the painting, just a flock of ducks on a grassy farmyard and the farmhouse in the background. And it was a large painting and rather pretty. Well, one day, their daughter Salvig came home from school eating an apple. She said a nice lady had given it to her on the street. Well, the next morning, Salvig was not in her bed. And the parents searched everywhere, but they could not find her. And then all of a sudden, her father shouted, There she is! That's Salvig feeding the ducks! He was pointing at the oil painting, and sure enough, Salvig was in it. She was standing in the farmyard in the act of throwing bread to the ducks out of a basket. And the father rushed up to the painting and touched her. But that didn't help. She was just simply a part of the painting, just a picture painted on the canvas. Can you see Salvig? So imagine that. That's their daughter, and they went up to touch the painting, and it just feels like a painting. Did you ever see that painting, Grandmama, with the little girl in it? Many times, my grandmother said. And the peculiar thing was that little Solveig kept changing her position in the picture. One day she'd actually be inside the farmhouse and you could see her face looking out the window. Another day she'd be far over to the left with a duck in her arms. Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandmama? Nobody did. Wherever she was, whether outside feeding the ducks or inside looking out of the window, she was always motionless, just a figure painted in oils. It was very odd indeed. My grandmother said, very odd. And what was most odd of all was that as the years went by, she kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years, the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years, she was middle-aged. And then all at once, 54 years after it had all happened, she disappeared from the picture altogether. You mean she died? I said. Who knows, my grandmother said. Some very mysterious things go on in the world of witches. All right, that's 2 kids you've told me about, I said. What about the third one? Oh, the third one was little Birgit Svensson, my grandmother said. She lived just across the road from us, and one day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month, she had turned into a large white chicken. Her parents kept her for years in a pen in the garden, and she even laid eggs. What colored eggs? I said. Brown ones, my grandmother said. Biggest eggs I've ever seen in my life. Her mother made omelets out of them, and they were delicious. I gazed up at my grandmother, who was sat there like some ancient queen on her throne. Her eyes were misty gray, and they seemed to be looking at something many miles away. The cigar was the only real thing about her at that moment, and the smoke it made billowed around her head in blue clouds. But the little girl who became a chicken, she didn't disappear, I said. No, not Birgit. She lives on for many years, laying her brown eggs. But you said all of them disappeared. I made a mistake, my grandmother said. I'm getting old, can't remember everything. So this is Birgit. She became a chicken, and she laid eggs. What happened to the 4th child? I asked. Oh, the 4th child was a boy called Harold, my grandmother said. And one morning his skin went all grayish yellow, and then it became hard and crackly like the shell of a nut. And by evening, the boy had turned to stone. Stone? I said. You don't mean real stone. Granite, she said. I'll take you to see him if you'd like. They still keep him in the house. He stands in the hall, a little stone statue. Visitors lean their umbrellas up against him. There he is. He's just a stone statue that they put their umbrellas up against. Although I was very young, I was not prepared to believe everything my grandmother told me, and yet she spoke with such conviction, with such utter seriousness, and with never a smile on her face or a twinkle in her eye, and I found myself beginning to wonder. Go on, Grandmama, I said. You told me there were 5 altogether. What happened to the last one? Would you like a puff of my cigar? She said. I'm only 7, Grandmama. I don't care what age you are, she said. You'll never catch a cold if you smoke cigars. First of all, is that true? No, smoking is not good for you, as we all know. So Grandmama was a little naughty sometimes. Luckily, he didn't ever want to do that. Cigars stink. What about number 5, Grandmama? Number 5, she said, chewing on the end of her cigar as though it was a delicious asparagus. That was rather an interesting case. A 9-year-old boy, his name was Leaf, was summer holidaying with his family on the fjord, and the whole family was picnicking and swimming off the rocks on one of those little islands, and young Leaf dived into the water, and his father, who was watching him, noticed that he stayed under the water for an unusually long time, and when he came to the surface at last, he wasn't Leaf anymore. What was he, Grandmama? He was a porpoise, so kind of similar to a dolphin. He was not. He couldn't have been. Well, yeah, he was a lovely young porpoise, she said, and as friendly as could be. Grandmama, I said. Yes, my darling. Did he really and truly turn into a porpoise? Absolutely, she said. I knew his mother well. She told me all about it. She told me how Leaf the porpoise stayed with them all the afternoon, giving his brothers and sisters rides on his back, and they had a wonderful time. And then he waved a flipper at them and swam away, never to be seen again. But Grandmama, I said, how did they know that the porpoise was actually Leaf? He talked to them, my grandmother said. He laughed and joked with them all the time when he was giving them rides. That's Leaf, the porpoise, and his brothers and sisters playing after he got turned into a porpoise. But wasn't there the most tremendous fuss when this happened? I said. Not much, my grandmother said. You must remember that here in Norway, we are used to that sort of thing. There are witches everywhere. There's probably one living on our street this very moment. It's time to go to bed. A witch wouldn't come in my window at night, would she? I asked, quaking a little. No, my grandmother said, a witch will never do silly things like climbing up drain pipes or breaking into people's houses. You'll be quite safe in your bed. Come along. I'll tuck you in. More tomorrow.